If you had told me one evening could change everything, I wouldn't have believed you. But as I sat on the sofa, staring at the untouched glass of wine, the warm light of the lamp spilling across the room, I knew there was no undoing what had happened. It was like the universe had spun out of control, and I was left trying to find my footing. Just moments ago, the house had been calm, unusually so. The ticking of the clock was the only sound breaking the stillness. It was one of those rare evenings where I had the house to myself. David, my husband, was away. For the first time in what felt like forever, I was enjoying the quiet, savoring the absence of chaos. Then the front door opened. It wasn't David. It was Mason. He stepped inside, unannounced like a shadow slipping into the light. At first, I thought I was imagining it. But no, there he stood, tall and steady, his eyes searching mine. The moment felt surreal, like a dream I couldn't wake from. My breath caught in my chest, and my voice trembled when I finally managed to speak. "Mason," I whispered, unsure if I wanted an answer. He didn't reply immediately. Instead, he lingered in the doorway, as if battling an unseen force. "I just came to grab something," he finally said, his tone clipped, almost hesitant. The silence that followed was unbearable. We stood there, caught in a standoff neither of us had prepared for. The room felt charged, the air heavy with unspoken words. When he stepped closer, my heart pounded so loudly I thought he might hear it. There was something in his eyes I couldn't place, something raw and impossible to ignore. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice softer now. "I'm fine," I replied too quickly, the lie sitting heavy on my tongue. But I wasn't fine. The walls felt like they were closing in. When Mason bent down to pick up a scarf I dropped, our fingers brushed briefly. It was just a touch, fleeting and innocent, but it sent a jolt through me that I couldn't explain. I pulled my hand back, my face burning with emotions I didn't want to acknowledge. Mason's voice broke the tension. "I should go," he murmured, though he didn't move right away. His eyes lingered on mine, filled with something that felt like a question neither of us dared to answer. "Okay," I said, though I didn't mean it. When he finally left, the silence he left behind was deafening. I sat there, my thoughts spiraling, my emotions tangled in knots. Confusion, guilt, fear, everything churned inside me. But there was something else, something I couldn't name, and that terrified me more than anything. It's strange how life can change in ways you never expect. When I first met Mason, I had no idea how much of an impact he would have on me. David had introduced him as his son, his pride evident in every word. I'd smiled politely, doing my best to ignore the awkwardness that came with being a stepmother to someone so close to my own age. Mason was quiet, reserved, and in the beginning, he stayed out of my way. We existed in the same house, but led separate lives. Over time, though, that changed. Mason started to open up, and I began to see a side of him I hadn't noticed before. He was thoughtful, reflective, and attentive in a way that caught me off guard. Meanwhile, David was consumed by work, always on a call, always on a plane, always somewhere else. The distance between us grew, and Mason became an unexpected presence in the empty spaces of my life. At first, I told myself it was nothing, a harmless connection. But deep down, I knew better. Mason didn't just fill the silence. He made me feel seen in a way I hadn't felt in years. And then that rainy night happened. Mason had been working in the backyard, fixing an old swing David had long forgotten about. By the time he came inside, he was soaked to the bone, his hair plastered to his forehead. I handed him a towel, trying to keep things casual, but the air between us was anything but. He sat down, and for a moment, neither of us spoke. "I'm sorry if I'm intruding," he said finally. "I can leave." "No," I said quickly. "It's fine." But it wasn't fine. Nothing about this was fine. The silence between us was thick, heavy with words we couldn't say. When our eyes met, the space between us felt too small, too charged. And then it happened. A kiss. Unplanned, unstoppable, wrong. The days that followed were a blur of emotions. Mason kept his distance, and I tried to convince myself it was for the best. But the weight of what had happened between us was suffocating. Every glance, every accidental touch, every moment of silence felt loaded with meaning. It was like we were both walking a tightrope, one misstep away from falling into chaos. One evening, I found Mason in the backyard again, his hands busy with the swing. The sight of him stopped me in my tracks. "Mason," I called softly. He looked up, his eyes shadowed with conflict. "We can't keep doing this," he said, his voice steady but strained. "I know," I replied, though it felt like a lie. When Mason left that evening, it felt like a piece of me went with him. I was left to pick up the fragments of my life, to rebuild what I had broken with David. Mason's absence left a hollow ache, but it also brought clarity. Love, I realized, isn't about fleeting moments of connection. It's about choice. It's about commitment. Slowly, I began to focus on my marriage. David and I spent more time together, talking, laughing, trying to repair the cracks that had formed over the years. It wasn't easy, but it was necessary. And through it all, the memory of Mason lingered, a bittersweet reminder of a chapter I couldn't erase. Even now, I wonder where Mason is. If he thinks of me, if he regrets what happened, I'll never know, and maybe that's for the best. What I do know is this: life isn't perfect, and neither is love. But we learn, we grow, and sometimes the hardest choices are the ones that define who we are. Looking back, I see the mistakes I made and the lessons they taught me. Mason was a fleeting moment, a spark that burned too brightly, too quickly. But David is my anchor, my choice, my commitment. And in the end, that's what matters most. Even after Mason left, the house felt different. It wasn't just the emptiness. It was the weight of everything that had happened, the emotions I couldn't seem to untangle. Nights felt longer, quieter, and the memories of his presence lingered in every corner of the house. I'd catch myself glancing toward the backyard, half expecting to see him there, working on the swing or fixing something David had forgotten about. But he wasn't there, and that absence felt like a wound I couldn't heal. David, as usual, remained oblivious. He was still the devoted husband, coming home late from meetings, occasionally surprising me with small gifts or a kiss on the forehead, as if those gestures could patch up the distance between us. I tried to smile, to play the role of the loving wife, but deep down, I felt like I was drowning in guilt. Every time he looked at me with affection, my heart ached. I wanted to tell him everything, to confess and unburden myself, but I couldn't. It would destroy him. It would destroy us. I tried to bury myself in routines, cooking, cleaning, errands, anything to keep my mind occupied. But it didn't help. Memories of Mason seeped into every quiet moment, every pause. I remembered his laugh, the way his eyes lit up when he talked about something he cared about, and the warmth of his presence that made the loneliness bearable. I hated myself for missing him, for feeling this way, but the emotions refused to fade. One evening, as I was folding laundry in the living room, I heard a knock at the door. My heart leaped, foolishly hoping it might be Mason, but it was just a delivery man with a package David had ordered. I thanked him, shut the door, and leaned against it, the disappointment hitting me harder than it should have. What was wrong with me? Why couldn't I move on? The next day, David suggested we go out for dinner. He must have noticed something was off, though he didn't press me about it. I agreed, hoping a night out might help me reset. We went to our favorite restaurant, the one where we'd had our first date. The soft lighting, the gentle hum of conversation, the familiar menu. It should have felt comforting. But as I sat there, listening to David talk about his day, I felt like a stranger in my own life. I smiled and nodded at the right moments, but my mind was elsewhere, lost in a world I couldn't escape. When we got home, David kissed me goodnight and went to bed early, exhausted from work. I stayed up, sitting on the sofa with a book I couldn't focus on. The house was quiet again, and in the silence, my thoughts drifted back to Mason. I wondered where he was, what he was doing, if he thought about me the way I thought about him. The guilt twisted in my chest, but it didn't stop the longing. A few weeks later, I saw Mason by chance. I was at the grocery store, pushing a cart through the produce aisle, when I spotted him near the bakery section. My heart skipped a beat, and for a moment, I froze. He hadn't seen me yet, and part of me wanted to turn around and leave. But my feet betrayed me, moving toward him before I could stop myself. "Mason," I said softly, my voice trembling. He looked up, and for a second, I saw the same storm in his eyes that I'd felt since he left. But then he forced a small smile, nodding politely. "Hi." It was awkward, standing there between rows of bread and pastries, pretending like everything was normal. I wanted to ask him how he was, what he'd been up to, but the words wouldn't come out. Instead, we stood there in strained silence, the unspoken tension thick between us. "I should go," he said finally, his voice quiet but firm. "Right," I replied, my throat tight. "Take care, Mason." He nodded again and walked away, disappearing around the corner of the aisle. I stood there for a moment, feeling the loss all over again, before forcing myself to finish shopping. That brief encounter stayed with me for days. Seeing him had reopened wounds I thought were starting to heal. It reminded me of everything I had tried to suppress, and I hated how much power he still had over me. I needed to let go. I needed to move on. But I didn't know how. David and I continued to work on our marriage, though it often felt like we were just going through the motions. We talked more, spent more time together, and even started planning a weekend getaway to rekindle the spark we'd lost. I wanted to believe it would help, that it would bring us closer, but a part of me knew the real problem wasn't just our marriage, it was me. I was holding on to something I shouldn't, and until I let it go, nothing would truly change. One night, as I lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling, I made a decision. I couldn't keep living like this. I needed closure, not just with Mason, but with myself. The next morning, while David was at work, I sat down and wrote a letter. It wasn't for Mason, it was for me. I poured out everything I'd been feeling, every emotion I'd been too afraid to confront. The longing, the guilt, the confusion, it all spilled onto the page. By the time I finished, tears were streaming down my face, but I felt lighter, freer. I didn't keep the letter. I burned it in the fireplace, watching the words turn to ash. It felt symbolic, like I was letting go of the weight I'd been carrying. It didn't erase the pain or the memories, but it was a start. Over time, things began to shift. I threw myself into rebuilding my relationship with David, focusing on the love and commitment we'd built over the years. It wasn't perfect, and there were still moments when the past crept in, but I learned to push those thoughts aside. Mason became a memory, a chapter in my life that had ended. And while the scars remained, they were a reminder of the lessons I'd learned. Love isn't easy. It's messy, complicated, and sometimes it hurts. But it's also a choice, a decision to stay, to fight, to grow. And as I looked at David, sitting across from me at the dinner table one evening, laughing at something silly I'd said, I knew I had made the right choice. Life wasn't perfect, but it was mine. And that was enough. I sat at the dining table, staring at my coffee cup. The house was quiet, almost too quiet, as if it knew the weight I carried inside. David had already left for work, and I was left with the echoes of my thoughts. I had told myself that burning the letter would bring me closure, that letting go of Mason on paper would make it easier to move forward. But the truth was, his presence lingered, not in the physical sense, but in my mind, my heart. I didn't know how to stop it, how to silence the part of me that still reached for him in the stillness. Days turned into weeks, and I buried myself in routines. I tried harder with David, throwing myself into our relationship, hoping to rebuild what had been quietly unraveling for years. We had our moments, moments of laughter, moments of connection, but the shadow of Mason lingered in the background. I wanted to believe I could push it away, lock it in some forgotten corner of my mind, but it was never that simple. One afternoon, I decided to clear out the attic. It was something David had been asking me to do for months, and I figured the physical work might help distract me. As I sifted through old boxes, pulling out forgotten photo albums and dusty trinkets, I came across a box I didn't recognize. It was small, tucked away in a corner, and when I opened it, I found a scarf, my scarf, the one Mason had handed me that night. I froze, the memory rushing back like a tidal wave. I could see him standing there, his eyes meeting mine, the unspoken tension between us. My heart ached as I held the scarf, the fabric soft and familiar in my hands. For a moment, I thought about throwing it away, but I couldn't. Instead, I folded it carefully and set it aside, unsure of what to do with it. That night, David noticed I was quieter than usual. He asked if I was okay, and I forced a smile, telling him I was just tired. He didn't press me, which I was grateful for, but I could see the concern in his eyes. He was trying, and I knew I owed it to him to try too. The next day, I decided to meet a friend for lunch, someone I hadn't seen in a while. It was nice to talk about ordinary things, to laugh about old memories and share updates on our lives. For a couple of hours, I felt lighter, like I could breathe again. But as I drove home, the heaviness returned. It was as if Mason's absence had left a void that nothing could fill. One evening, while David was working late, I sat on the back porch, watching the stars. The air was cool, the kind of crispness that hinted at the change of seasons. I thought about Mason, about the swing he had worked on, now perfectly fixed and standing as a silent reminder of him. I thought about the moments we had shared, the things left unsaid. And I thought about how I had to let him go, truly let him go, if I ever wanted to move forward. The next morning, I made a decision. I drove to the park, the one where Mason and I had once gone for a walk when David was away. It was quiet, the kind of peaceful stillness that made it easy to think. I sat on a bench, watching the trees sway gently in the breeze, and I let myself feel everything I had been trying to suppress. The pain, the longing, the guilt, it all came rushing to the surface. I didn't cry, not this time. Instead, I sat there, breathing deeply, letting the emotions wash over me. And then slowly, I let them go. I told myself that Mason was a chapter, not the whole story. He had been a part of my life, a significant part, but it was time to close that chapter and move on. When I got home, David was waiting for me. He smiled, pulling me into a hug, and for the first time in a long time, I let myself relax into his arms. I held him tightly, grateful for his steadiness, his presence. He didn't ask where I had been, and I didn't offer an explanation. It didn't matter. What mattered was that I was here, with him, and I was finally ready to be present in our life together. In the weeks that followed, things began to shift. David and I spent more time together, cooking meals, taking walks, talking about things we hadn't talked about in years. We laughed more, and for the first time in what felt like forever, the house felt warm again. It wasn't perfect. Nothing ever is, but it was real. And that was enough. There were still moments when I thought about Mason. Late at night, when the house was quiet and the world felt far away, I would wonder where he was, what he was doing. I would wonder if he thought about me, if he missed me the way I missed him. But those moments grew fewer and farther between. Slowly, the ache faded, replaced by a quiet acceptance. One day, David surprised me with a weekend trip. He had planned everything: a cozy cabin in the mountains, a place where we could escape and just be. As we drove through winding roads, the trees stretching high above us, I felt a sense of peace I hadn't felt in a long time. The cabin was perfect, tucked away in the woods, with a fireplace and a view of the stars. That first night, as we sat by the fire, sipping wine and talking about nothing in particular, I realized how far we had come. David leaned over, taking my hand in his. "I love you," he said, his voice soft but steady. "I love you too," I replied, and for the first time in a long time, I meant it completely. The trip was exactly what we needed. It gave us a chance to reconnect, to remember why we had chosen each other in the first place. And when we returned home, things felt different. Better, stronger. As the months passed, life settled into a rhythm. David and I continued to grow closer, building a life that felt full and meaningful. The memories of Mason still lingered, but they no longer held the same power over me. They were just that, memories. Pieces of the past that had shaped me but didn't define me. One evening, as I stood in the kitchen, cooking dinner, David walked in and wrapped his arms around me. "Smells good," he said, kissing my cheek. I smiled, leaning into him. "It's your favorite," I replied, feeling a warmth that wasn't just from the stove. As we sat down to eat, talking and laughing about our day, I felt a sense of contentment I hadn't thought possible. Life wasn't perfect. It never is, but it was mine. And for the first time in a long time, I felt truly at peace. Looking back, I realized that everything I had been through, the pain, the mistakes, the confusion, had taught me something important. Love isn't always easy. It's not about perfection or never making mistakes. It's about choosing to stay, to fight, to grow. It's about learning from the past and building a future worth fighting for. And as I sat there, watching David tell a story with his usual animated gestures, I knew I had made the right choice. Mason would always be a part of my story, a reminder of a time when I felt lost. But David was my home, my anchor. And that was all I needed.